Welcome to part 3 of the First Punic War. And now in the last video, we talked about that victory for Rome at Agrigentum. And after that, there was sort of a general state of euphoria in Rome. And now the Romans looked to push deeper into Sicily. But in order to accomplish this, Rome needed to expand her naval presence around Sicily. And so a fleet of 120 ships was constructed. And this not only would allow the Romans to contest the Carthaginians at sea, but a navy would also provide close support to the Roman legions on land in Sicily. Now, Consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio was placed in charge of the fleet, and Consul Caius Duilius was put in charge of the Roman legions based in Sicily. And so that's kind of interesting. One of the consuls was placed in charge of the fleet, and the other in charge of all of the Roman land-based legions. So the action was about to shift to the sea, and that's characteristic of the First Punic War. You will see the fighting shift back and forth between land and sea, and naval engagements would mark some of the most important battles during the First Punic War. Most of the decisive battles were fought at sea. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about the Scipios for a minute. Now, the Scipios first appear in Roman history during the destruction of Veii, and you will remember that was part of the Etruscan Wars. And so the Scipio name had a major presence in the history of the Roman Republic, and they will in the First Punic War and the Second Punic War. And so they were a very distinguished branch of one of the most powerful patrician families, the Cornelia. And as I said, in the Second Punic War, we will be talking about another very famous Scipio. Now, the first naval engagement between Carthage and Rome occurred at Lipara Island. And you can see that island right here on this map. Now, Lipari is the Italian spelling, and Lipara is the Latin spelling. So we will go with the Latin spelling. Now, this engagement that took place at Lipara was more of a precursor to the larger battle of Mylae, which we'll talk about in a few slides. Now, Scipio put out to sea with the first 17 ships that were constructed. So what's important to note here is that the full Roman fleet was not quite ready to put out to sea. Nonetheless, Scipio sailed to the straits between Italy and Sicily, and there he received word that Lipara might defect to Rome. Scipio decided to take the initiative and sail to Lipara, despite not having access to his full fleet. And this was typical of Roman consuls. They loved to take the initiative, and they loved to put their names on cities and territories that they conquered. So this tiny Roman squadron entered the harbor at Lipara, but were ambushed by the Carthaginian fleet. It's unclear if this was a trap that the Carthaginians intentionally set, but the Roman crews quickly abandoned their boats and took refuge on the island. And as a result, Scipio had no choice but to surrender. Now, this is where experienced crews were absolutely fundamental to fielding a good navy. An experienced crew might have had calmer nerves, and they might not have abandoned their ships so quickly, because a harbor can provide adequate protection for ships, protection from weather conditions and from enemy vessels on the outside. And the Athenians learned this the hard way near the end of the Peloponnesian War, when they decided not to use their harbor as a natural defense point and used a beach instead. And as a result, they were wiped out by a surprise attack by Lysander. And so, as I said, this wasn't such a terrible predicament. And so let's think about this for a second. Let's say the Carthaginians tried to sail into that harbor and a naval battle broke out in the harbor. Well, that would have eliminated the advantages that the faster Carthaginian ships had over the Roman ships. And so just perhaps the Romans could have pulled off a victory. But since the Roman crews abandoned their ships, there was no possibility for Scipio to launch any type of attack. And so the first round went to the Carthaginians. Now, a few days after Lipara, the Carthaginians decided to send their fleet down the coast of Italy to determine the size of the Roman fleet. And as they were rounding the tip of Italy, they ran right into the Roman fleet and were actually taken by surprise. And the Carthaginians lost several ships. And so for the Romans, that sort of took the sting off of the debacle at Lipara. Now, Scipio was replaced as fleet commander by the other Roman consul, Gaius Duilius, and Scipio was thoroughly discredited. But he would make a comeback later on, and we'll get to that in a future video. Now, the Romans realized they were no match against the skilled naval commanders of the Carthaginian navy. It took a high degree of skill and training to ram ships, which was the primary naval tactic of the day. And so the Romans simply didn't have the time to train their sailors because they were already in the midst of a major war with Carthage. And the other major problem was that the Roman ships were slower than the Carthaginian vessels. And so Rome had to even the odds, as the cliche goes, and they decided to bring the fight to land, and this led to the development of a device called the Corvis. Now, the name of the inventor is lost to history, but it must have been somebody who possessed incredible ingenuity. Now, the Corvis was essentially a long wooden bridge that was 36 feet long, and it was operated by these huge pulleys that could lower and raise the Corvis. Now, the Corvis had this huge iron spike attached to it, and that spike could splinter right through the planks of the enemy ship and essentially disable it. And so only the Romans could build such a device. It was practical, simple, and effective, and so it must be Roman, right? Now, as I said, the device eliminated the necessity of a tactical sea battle and would allow the Romans to board the Carthaginian vessels very quickly. And this would give the Romans an edge because now the fighting would go hand to hand, something the Romans were the best in the world at. And so with their new device, they were ready for the next major naval engagement. Now, the Romans received reports that the Carthaginian fleet was raiding off the coast of Mylae. This time, the Romans mobilized their entire fleet for this engagement. And so Duilius rushed to the scene, and the two fleets faced off in the first major naval battle of the war so far. Now, Hannibal, who you'll remember was in charge of the Carthaginian garrison at Agrigentum, was in charge of the Carthaginian fleet. Now, Polybius will tell us that the Carthaginians were perplexed by the Corvis that was located on the bows of the Roman ships. Nonetheless, the confident Carthaginians threw themselves at the Roman ships, and initially the Carthaginians succeeded in ramming a few of the Roman ships. But now that the Carthaginian ships were in close range, the Romans deployed their Corvis and started hooking the Carthaginian ships almost like fish. To the Carthaginians who were launching their own assault, this must have come as a hideous shock. And so now that this had turned into a land battle, the Carthaginian crews were absolutely no match against Roman soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. And boat after boat after boat was stormed. The Carthaginians would lose 30 ships in that initial frontal attack. With the Carthaginian frontal assault falling apart, the Carthaginians decided to change tactics in the middle of the fight. Now the Carthaginians attempted to use their speed to try to outflank the Romans. But the Romans were ready for this and once again reeled in more Carthaginian ships. It is unclear if the Romans simply turned their vessels around to face this new threat or if a second defensive line had already been in place guarding the rear. And so it was a stunning and shocking defeat for the Carthaginians. In just the course of a few hours, the Romans suddenly had the advantage at sea, and this was due in no small part to the success of the Corvis. And the Carthaginians really would have no answer for the Corvis throughout the war. Now, the Romans took in a massive haul of 50 Carthaginian ships, and so again it was a stunning victory. After Mylae, Duilius received a triumph in Rome at the Forum, and the captured prows of the Carthaginian ships were put on full display for the Roman crowd. No doubt this was to remind the masses that this was a Roman naval victory. Now, the fate of the Carthaginian general Hannibal was not a good one. He suffered another setback in Sardinia, where more Carthaginian ships were destroyed or captured by the Roman fleet. And this was the final blow for Hannibal, and he was executed by his own officers. Now, shortly after that, the action switched back to land. And as I said, that was typical of the First Punic War. Now, Segesta and Macella revolted in favor of Rome. Now, to prevent this, the Carthaginian general Hamilcar laid siege to both cities, but the Romans set out from Agrigentum and were successful in relieving both sieges in 260 BC. Now, that's why this Roman capture of Agrigentum was so important, because it was an advantageous location from which the Romans could launch attacks from. Now, in 259 BC, Hamilcar launched a surprise counterattack on Enna, which of course was in the possession of the Romans. And then he pushed on to Camarina. Now, Camarina, of course, was in Syracusan territory, so perhaps Hamilcar was hoping to flip the Syracusans to the Carthaginian side. But the Romans once again drove Hamilcar out of Camarina, then out of Enna, and then actually made a small push into Carthaginian territory, seizing a few more towns. And so that consumed about a year's worth of fighting. And so that takes us up to 259 BC. Now this would set the stage for another naval battle, which we will get to in the next video.